In this video, I will outline some work from two numismatic heroes, Andrew Watson and John Munro. Both taught economic history at Toronto University. Both took a stand defending truth against political propaganda. Both their stands failed to get traction. Locked in the conventions of pre-existing propaganda, the academic community just shrugged and went on with business as usual. This story starts with Robert Lopez, a history professor who fled Mussolini's Italy in 1939 and spent his war years writing anti-fascist scripts for the Voice of America. Post-war, he gained a professorship at Yale. Clearly, he was as much an expert on the political present as the economic past. In 1956, he wrote a paper, Back to Gold 1252. It concerned the launch of gold coinage in Europe between 1252 and 1344, which he felt defined the superiority of that European civilization. He wrote that the introduction of fine gold coinage was the most spectacular token of the economic gains accumulated by the Catholic world during the preceding 2 or 3 centuries, and a tangible symbol of the initial superiority of the West over the East. In 1967, at Toronto, Andrew Watson published Back to Gold and Silver. The title makes it very clear that he was targeting the pro-gold thesis of Lopez, and he wrote, "Rulers in all parts of Europe were ready to procure the metal needed to maintain a strong gold currency by sacrificing silver. They were prepared to let the common people who received their incomes in silver bear the burden of keeping intact a prestige coinage for the use of princes and merchants." For Lopez, the turn to gold was a spectacular success. For Watson, a disaster for the general population. If we turn from coins to general life, around 1350 to 1480, what we actually see is surely a disaster. Barbara Tuchman put it this way in 1978. The period was a violent, tormented, bewildered, suffering and disintegrating age, a time, as many thought, of Satan triumphant. She tells us that when she started the work, she expected to find that all the problems stemmed from the Black Death. But it did not. She never put her finger on the underlying problem. Like Tuchman, you were probably told that later 14th century peasants got huge pay rises due to the shortage of labour after the plague. Unfortunately, that does not fit the facts. Firstly, most of Europe's silver had been exported to Islam, and what remained was mostly hoarded by the wealthy. So, high wages could not be paid. There was nothing much to pay them with. Secondly, all over Europe, ordinary people were rising in revolt. That makes no sense if they were all getting rich. In fact, there were no high wages. To understand this, read the paper Unreal Wages by Hatcher, details in the notes. The book I would want to see would be a collaboration between Tuchman and Watson, putting the monetary economy central stage, but that could never be. Watson had already stopped all work on monetary history in 1967, the very year he published. Watson was told by the Dean of Faculty that he had been awarded a Ford Foundation grant to go study the history of Islamic agriculture instead. And that is what he did. His fight was over as soon as it began. Lopez had correctly figured out what the powerful foundations wanted to hear. It was not what Watson had written. Meanwhile, a young John Munro was taking a PhD at Yale, supervised by Lopez himself and Misguided during 1960 to 64. In 1968 he was taken on at Toronto, stepping into the empty shoes just left by Watson and teaching monetary history. It was only late in his career, in 1998, that Munro published The Truth in his The Maze of Medieval Mint Metrology. The paper revealed a problem he had hit right back in 1962. His teacher at Yale, Harry Miskimin, had claimed that medieval measurement of weight in England and France was governed by one single grain. That was complete nonsense, and he quickly found 20 prior authors rejecting it. In 1998 he wrote, "In presenting my own dissertation, accepted by Yale in 1965, I decided that discretion was the better part of valour, and made no mention of this rather painful dispute with both Robert Lopez and Harry Miskimin, not wishing to endanger my friendship with either of them, nor to endanger Miskimin's untenured post at Yale. It will be noted that I have delayed publication of these matters until after the recent deaths of both Robert Lopez and Harry Miskimin." The paper then goes on to give a correct account of the relationship between the French mark de Troyes and the English Tower pound as being very close to 1 to 1.43, and in fact exactly 7 to 10. Preserving his friendship with Lopez and Miskimin, however, turned out to be a price too high. Professional study of historical metrology was already on its last legs in the 1960s. By 1998 there was no one left who would comprehend, defend and sharpen Munro's argument. Further, by making a complex maze of the matter, no one, apart from myself, seems to have taken it on board. I first made contact with John Munro around 2010, making some suggestions about how to take his work forward. John was enthusiastic, but criticised me for being too slow to answer his mails. The reason for that only became clear when he died of cancer in 2013. Meanwhile, I only put the final piece of the puzzle in place in 2018. It shows how John's account was true, not just empirically, but by the very definitions of metrological terms as the medieval world understood them. The rest of this video will be the calculations based upon those definitions. The historical background to the definitions was given earlier in videos 1 to 8. Please do let me know in the comments if you grasp the force of these calculations. Or contact me direct if you need clarification. The fundamental standard here is the one created in Sumer before 2000 BC. For the purpose of the mathematical definition, that standard will be called M, but it has had the following names: the Minor of Shulgi, the Minor of Darius, the Arab Rattle Kabir, 16 troy ounces of Elizabeth I of England. Any small variation in weight, seen in specific physical examples over the millennia, is irrelevant to these mathematical matters. Importantly, recall that the Attic Minor is m times 7 over 8, and the Roman Libra is 12 over 16 of Attic. Note that, by definition, a troy money pound was split into 12 troy ounces, each of 20 troy pennies, each of 24 troy grains, and that a Tower pound was exactly 15 over 16 of a troy pound. Meanwhile, a later medieval Paris or Troyes pound was split into 16 ounces, each of 8 gros, each of 3 denier, each of 24 Paris grains. Thus the mathematical divisions of the fundamental standard M into grains were codified in the time of Abd al-Malik. The troy grain comes out at M times 1 over 7,680. The Paris grain comes out at M times 7 over 65,536. Notice that in the later medieval period the Paris or Troyes pound changed and calculation became more complicated, but the answer was still exactly the same. Thus the ratio of Troy grain weight to Paris grain weight reduces to 105 to 128. Let us now turn to the ratio Monroe sought, the Tower pound to the Troyes or Paris mark. As we see, after simplification, the ratio becomes exactly 10 to 7. Thus Monroe's 1.43 is a good approximation of the real ratio, which cannot actually be written down, being 1.428571 recurring. But further, his ratio, found empirically and given in his equation 1, was 31.5 to 45, which of course is 7 to 10. I hope you found this explanation of how the medieval mathematical mind worked helpful. You might conclude, as I do, that some guys back then had a really excellent grasp of how numbers fitted together. I will stop now, but having discussed the relationship between Yale University, Toronto University and the Ford Foundation over the period 1967 to 1996, I will leave you to think a while about what the Rees Committee had already said about the Ford Foundation right back in 1954.